The story that we have for you today is not only one that was brutal and senseless and about a murder of a woman named Mamie Thurman, but also the conviction of an innocent man based only on the prejudices of the times. Mamie's death not only caused the town of Logan, West Virginia to learn of her secret double life, but also the location of a speakeasy that catered to the elite men of Logan, with their wives as well as their mistresses. Now, while two men, one of which was conducting an affair with Mamie, were arrested just hours after Mamie's body was found, only one was forced to endure a grand jury trial that resulted in his conviction, and it was a black handyman named Clarence Stevenson. Now, through scouring newspapers and reading the 800 plus pages of the grand jury trial, the goal of this episode is to bring to light not only how an innocent man was convicted over 93 years ago. Think about that. Wow. But also how the true killer of Mamie Thurman will more than likely never be known. Welcome to Creepalachia, and we are doing a local legend today. It's a true devastating legend, but the tale of Mamie Thurman, and I couldn't be more appreciative than having your time this evening. I know I've gotten a lot of inquiries about this case, and I've always wanted to do a longer episode, so shout out to Miranda Weeks for her extensive work on this. There's so many documents she went through, and we really tried to get this one right for you all. So before we get started, be sure to like this video, subscribe to Creepalachia on YouTube if you haven't, and I appreciate you being here. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, leave a review and let us know how the show is, and that'll really help it be found. And without further ado, welcome to Creepalachia and the story of Mamie Thurman. So Mamie Morrison was born on September 12th, 1900 in Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville. How do you say it? Louisville? Louisville. That's from what I understand. I was born in Ashland, so that's how we're going to say it on here. But anyways, September 12th, 1900 in Louisville, Kentucky. Her father was a prominent contractor named George Morrison, Sr., but it is unknown who her mother was. Not much is known of Mamie's life until she eventually met and married a man named Jack Thurman sometime in 1920. Now, the couple moved from Bradfordsville, Kentucky to Logan, West Virginia in 1924, where Jack worked various odd jobs until becoming a city patrolman just 15 months before her murder. Now, the couple rented a 2-bedroom apartment over a garage from a local handyman named Harry Robertson, whose own house stood mere feet away from the Thurman residence. Now, the Robertson house, as well as the apartment rented by the Thurmans, had been built by Mamie's father. Jack Thurman's usual schedule was from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., during which he was of the belief that his wife was at their home the whole time. Based on his admission, it wasn't until her brutal murder that Jack learned he was far from the only man in Mamie's life. Now, prior to her murder, Mamie was known to the locals as a beautiful, kind woman who took an active part in church on Sundays with Sunday school work, and by all accounts, bore a good reputation. She always dressed in what was considered the highest of fashions at the time and loved wearing different styles of hats. The more outlandish, the better. We all know that person. And it wasn't until her brutal murder that the town of Logan would learn of her nightlife activities. That would earn her the nickname the Stratton Street Vixen. Now, her murder brought to light what only the elite of Logan already knew: that Mamie and the man who owned her apartment, Harry Robertson, had been having an affair for over 2 years prior to the murder. Now, the reason that only the elite of the town knew of the affair was because they had all had a meeting place in common, a speakeasy in downtown Logan, and the building was known as the Key Club. Now, according to Harry, it was publicly known as the Logan Businessmen's Club. Despite 1932 being a year before Prohibition ended, this secret club was used by the elite men of Logan to party and illegally drink with their wives as well as their mistresses. Now, for those who don't know, speakeasies were created during the Prohibition era, which started in 1920 and ended in 1933. Now, prior to the start of Prohibition, the main places to get liquor were saloons that only catered to men. Now, speakeasies were basically secret and unlicensed clubs that allowed men and women access to illegal liquor, and that you needed a secret passcode to be allowed into. Now, during the Prohibition era, you could only get liquor legally for medicinal purposes or religious reasons. Speakeasies ranged from fancy clubs that featured jazz bands and fancy dance floors to dingy back rooms, basements, and even rooms inside houses and apartments. Now, bootlegging, which is what the illegal distribution of liquor was referred to, was the main contributor to the explosion of organized crime in America. While speakeasies were supposed to be a secret, that secret was generally ill-kept. This was back before social media, when town gossip was the main source of news in most places. Now, speakeasy owners were able to continue their illegal dealings by exploiting low-paid police officers and paying them to look the other way, which still happens occasionally, we all know. But Harry and Mamie had known each other since her and Jack moved into his apartment above his garage, around 8 years prior. But their affair didn't allegedly begin until a little over 2 years before the murder. Now, for the 18 years leading up to Mamie's death, Harry was a bookkeeper at what was formerly Guyan Valley Bank, but had merged into the First National Bank prior to Mamie's death. Harry Robertson was also president of the city commission and was responsible for getting Jack Thurman his job as a city patrolman. Now, Mamie was also employed at the Guyan Valley Bank as a clerk in the same department as Harry, and had been for about 2 or 3 years, but was not an employee at the time of her death. Harry admitted during questioning that their affair began shortly before Mamie stopped working at the bank. Now, while Harry and Mamie were known to frequent the elusive Key Club, it was discovered that was not the only place they conducted their affair. Brown chicken, brown cow. Brown chicken, brown cow. I'm sorry, I'm going to make offensive jokes during this, but no disrespect to Mamie at all. This is a tragedy. Through the testimony of Harry as well as his handyman, Clarence Stevenson, it would be learned that Clarence had been picking up Mamie and taking her to meet Harry starting in March of 1932. It would only ever be Mamie and Clarence in the car to and from these meetings, and Mamie was always dropped off somewhere in town rather than her house. This was apparently at Mamie's request because she didn't want to risk her husband seeing her being dropped off. Because, you know, brown chicken, brown cat, scandalous happening. Now, Harry and Clarence were known to go fox hunting, usually after dark, in various places including on Trace Mountain, where Mamie's body was found, now known as 22 Mine Road. It was on these fox hunts that Harry would send Clarence back to town to pick up Mamie and bring her to wherever they were hunting. Now, the couple would then disappear into the forest in order to sleep together. I'm sorry, I'll stop doing that. The last time they had met prior to her murder was the Saturday before, when Mamie requested Clarence pick her up and take her to a place called Crooked Creek, where Harry was. Now, Clarence had testified that Harry had given him a letter to deliver to Mamie the day after their last known meeting, but Clarence did not know what it said. On Monday, Mamie told Clarence to tell Harry that she read his note carefully and then destroyed it. Now, according to Clarence, he and Harry, as well as another man, were supposed to go fox hunting the night of June 21st, and Mamie had been invited to go with them. However, this trip was canceled sometime that afternoon by Clarence because he had been sick for a few days and had even gone to the doctor the day before, where he was given medicine. Now, Harry and Clarence decided that they would go fox hunting the night of June 22nd instead, so Clarence was instructed to inform Mamie the change of plans. Now, whether Harry's wife, Louise Robertson, was aware of the affair prior to Mamie's death depends on whether you believe the newspaper coverage of the preliminary trial or her testimony in the grand jury trial. So Harry and Louise have been married for quite some time and had 2 young children together. Now, unfortunately, the transcripts from the preliminary trial no longer exist, which leaves us with no choice but to report what happened based on the newspapers. So according to the papers, Louise Robertson admitted to police during questioning prior to the trial that she had suspicions about the affair since a year prior, and that she knew for certain in October of 1931 that they were getting it on because brown chicken, brown cow. All right. Apologies. She also admitted to pleading with Harry to end the affair. However, Louise appeared to have changed her tune during the grand jury trial when she testified that she had only suspected they might be having an affair and that she never brought it up to her husband. Now, her and Mamie had been friends as well as members of the Logan's Women's Club until Louise stopped hanging out with her in January of 1932 due to her suspicions of her and Harry getting it on. Now, the eventual trial would also reveal that Harry Robertson was not the only man that Mamie had been having an affair with. Now, during his questioning, Harry admitted that Mamie had given him a list of about 16 other men around town that she had slept with. No judgments. I mean, you know, it's not right, but I digress. So despite the fact that the list could offer other suspects besides Harry and Clarence, it was not allowed to be spoken about during the trial. Now, according to Clarence, Mamie was trying to come between Harry and Louise, and Mamie had supposedly seen Louise getting into a car downtown with a man and had written the license plate number down. Now, the license plate number was found in her pocketbook when her body was discovered. It was also learned that Mamie and Clarence Stevenson had slept together at one point while the Robertsons were out of town. Now, it seems that this one insignificant little detail was what led to the town believing that Clarence was guilty, since interracial relationships were still considered illegal during this period. Yes, interracial relationships used to be illegal. Can you believe that? But unfortunately, this consensual encounter would be painted as an assault and would contribute to the theory that Clarence had tricked Mamie into meeting him on the night of June 21st in order to assault her. Now, according to this theory, once she began to fight off his advances, he had no choice but to kill her. Now, we will discuss how ludicrous this theory is later in the episode, so saddle up, partner. This one is crazy. Now, before discussing Mamie's last night, her subsequent death, and the trials that followed, we need to learn about another important character in this case, and that is the Robertsons' handyman, Clarence Stevenson. So let's dive into him. So Clarence was a black man and was born sometime in the year 1900, but his exact date of birth is unknown. Now, prior coverage of this case described him as a dwarf, but according to his Moundsville State Penitentiary intake form, he was 5'9", so like he's Tom Cruise height. Now, to qualify as a dwarf, you have to be less than 4'9", even 93 years ago. So 5'9", still pretty average. Now, he was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee, but came to Logan County sometime in 1920 and had officially lived there since sometime in 1924 and had a sister living somewhere in that section of the country. Now, that was a direct quote. He had previously lived in several places in Logan County, including Peach Creek, Dayhue, Macbeth, Laredo, Lundale, 7 and 8 Holden, before eventually moving to Logan. And I'm sure I got one of those pronunciations wrong. Let me know which one. Now, the place he lived the longest was Peach Creek, in which he lived there from 1924 until around November of 1930 and was still getting mail there at the time of his arrest. Now, Clarence was in a pretty bad automobile accident while living in Peach Creek, and that resulted in his nose being broken and gave him a bad gash on his forehead. This accident caused him to have frequent nosebleeds, which will be important to remember later. Keep that in mind. Now, he met Harry Robertson sometime in April of 1923, and the pair had been fox hunting together since sometime in 1925. What's the point of fox hunting? Is it just to, rid pests? I mean, we don't eat them, right? Hunters, I know hunters are listening to this. Someone email me, creepalachia@gmail.com. I gotta know what the point of fox hunting is. I guess it's just to remove a predator from the equation, like a wolf maybe? I don't know. But anyway, at the time of Mamie's death, Clarence had been living in the attic of the Robertson residence since January of 1932, but had lived there for a few months starting in May of 1931 as well. He originally came to stay with the Robertsons in May of 1931 after getting a finger on his left hand cut off while working at 22 Mine in Holden, West Virginia. Now, he stayed there until around the 1st of July when he went back to work at 22 Mine until January when he once again had a finger cut off. Mining used to be raw, y'all. You don't even know. It's raw now, but back then they'd be like, hey, 6-year-old, put on a hard hat and hit the freaking shovel. Let's go. It was crazy. Now, maybe not 1930. I think kids still worked in the mines, but I know early 1900s, it was bananas. Check out our Mine Wars episode. But anyway, had another finger lopped off. And this time it was on his right hand as well as part of a finger on his left hand. Now, he completed odd jobs for the Robertsons, such as mowing the lawn. I'm not even going to make a joke there. Doing the dishes, and feeding and taking care of the Robertsons and his hunting dogs in exchange for room and board. Now, together, Harry and Clarence owned around 35 hunting dogs, but not all of them were kept at the Robertson residence. It was in March of 1932 when he learned of the affair between Mamie and Harry, and when he began driving Mamie back and forth for her and Harry's meetings. Brown chicken, brown cow. Sorry, y'all. Using Harry's Ford sedan, or the back of his sedan. Now, the Ford was also used to transport as many as 12 dogs for fox hunting trips. Now that we know what little information is available about the man convicted of her murder, as you may know if you know about this case. If not, spoiler alert, too late. But we can now discuss the events of June 21st, 1932 and onward. So Mamie Thurman was seen leaving her home around 8 p.m. on June 21st, 1932 by Harry and Clarence, who saw her from their kitchen window. According to witness testimony, the last known sighting of Mamie that night was between 8 and 8:30 p.m. when she went into a local drugstore to purchase a pack of cigarettes. Now, according to the clerk at the drugstore, Mamie was in the store for about 20 minutes just talking and looking around before she left. Where Mamie went after she left the drugstore is a complete mystery. But if she did meet Harry Robertson at some point after that, it would have been sometime after midnight because his whereabouts from 8 p.m. until he supposedly went to bed around 11 are accounted for. However, given the only alibi for the rest of the night was his wife, the possibility that she might not tell the truth if he had left at any point has to be considered. Again, this was 1931. They didn't, slash your tires and set the bed on fire, really, back then. Now, according to Jack Thurman, Mamie's husband, he called his house on the night of June 21st, sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight, like he usually did. Although during his cross-examination, he stated it was around 1 a.m., but received no answer. He then walked over to the house to pull the windows down before the upcoming storm, and Mamie was still not there. He left his house around 1 a.m. and called a few people from different places in town to inquire about Mamie, but none of them had seen her. He and his partner, Hibbard Hatfield, then went back to their beat for an undetermined amount of time before Jack went back to his house again, where he stayed for about an hour, and Hibbard agreed to watch the street for her. Now, Jack testified that all 3 times he visited the house during his work hours, he did not sit down, but instead stood in the doorway watching outside. He eventually met back up with Hibbard, and stayed with him until their shift ended. Now, Jack and the chief of police, Meade Smeltzer, then drove around town and also walked up and down the riverbank looking for Mamie. While the exact time is not mentioned, Chief Smeltzer eventually told Jack that he should go home and get some rest and that he would contact state police and ask them for help looking for Mamie. Jack said then he went home and tried to sleep but was unsuccessful until he eventually got up around noon. Now, after waking up, Jack stated that he walked over to the Robertson household and asked Louise to get Clarence for him. It is important to note that Louise testified that Jack first came to their house around 7 a.m. to look for Mamie and then came back around 9 a.m. to ask for Clarence. These discrepancies can be explained away by the fact that the testimonies were given months after the murder, and also by considering the trauma that Jack endured upon learning of his wife's demise. Now, while the exact time isn't clear, it is known that Clarence and Jack drove to various places around town looking for Mamie that day until eventually arriving at First National Bank to see if Harry had heard anything. Now, according to Harry, the two arrived around 2:30 p.m., and this is when Jack would learn of why Mamie had been missing since the night before. Interestingly enough, shortly after arriving at the bank, a phone call for Harry Robertson was received. Now, the caller on the other line, Chief of Police Meade Smeltzer, who informed Harry that Mamie's mutilated body had unfortunately been discovered on Trace Mountain. Now, why Harry was the first to be informed instead of her own husband is unfortunately a question that can't be answered. But Clarence would testify that Jack reacted to the news of his wife's death by, quote, churning his fists into the corner of the wall and saying, "I have nothing more to live for. I want to die," end quote. Poor guy, I think. Now, Harry Robertson tried to take Jack's gun from him, but was unsuccessful. Clarence was told by Harry to keep an eye on Jack, and so he did, until Meade Smeltzer arrived and was able to disarm him. Now, Jack testified that he had no memory of what happened after he heard the news, but Clarence testified that he gave Jack a ride to the funeral home. Now, rumor has it that Jack was never quite the same after losing Mamie, and that shortly after the trial, he would move back to Kentucky, where he lived until his death. Mamie's body was found on June 22nd, 1932, around 1 p.m. on the top of Trace Mountain, now known as 22 Mine Road, by a 32-year-old deaf mute named Garland Davis, who was on the mountain looking for blackberries. Now, this location is about 10 miles from downtown Logan, and her body was laying in a ditch surrounded by briars on the right side of the road if you are heading towards Logan. Now, her pocketbook, her hat, and one shoe were located several feet away from her body. A case knife that appeared to have been stained was found about 150 feet away from her body by two local boys. Now, according to the police, these findings indicated that she was killed elsewhere and that her body had been taken to the top of the mountain to be hidden. She was found with her diamond ring, which cost around $200, according to her husband Jack, still on her finger. Now, due to her ring and her pocketbook being left behind, police were able to quickly determine that robbery was not a motive in this murder. Through eyewitness testimony, it was determined that the night before she had been wearing a blue dress with white polka dots and a matching blue braided turban-style hat. However, due to the rain that had occurred in the early hours of Wednesday morning, the blue dye from her dress had bled and made the whole dress appear blue, as well as giving her skin a ghoulish blue appearance. Terrifying. Now, police were informed of her body being found sometime around 2 p.m., which caused them to quickly head to the crime scene. And it was determined during her autopsy that her neck had been broken at the second cervical vertebrae, and her throat had been slashed, which severed her trachea, her carotid artery, and her jugular vein. She had also been shot twice on the left side of her head, with powder burns on that side as well, which indicated she had been shot at close range. Now, although the bullets were not found, it was speculated that the gun used to shoot her was a .38 caliber due to the size of the bullet wound. Now, .38 caliber bullets were placed inside the bullet holes and were able to fit with little resistance. Now, while it could not be determined which of her wounds were the exact cause of her death, a Dr. W.S. Rowan testified that he believed she could have been shot first due to the slash on her neck being caused by a smooth cut. Now, according to Dr. Rowan, a smooth cut would indicate that the perpetrator had a steady hand and that the act was calculated and deliberate. Those that examined her body believed that she had been killed anywhere between 12 to 18 hours earlier, although they do admit that the hours could not be accurately determined due to her body being left in the rain. Now, state police arrived at the Robertson household around 7 or 7:30 p.m. on June 22nd and asked Harry Robertson for permission to search the two-car garage below the Thurman apartment, although it is not clear what exactly prompted this search. Now, Harry and State Trooper C.A. Thompson went to the side with the Packard, and two other officers went to the side with the Ford sedan. Harry tried to go to the side where the Ford was, but was told to leave. Now, Harry testified that he heard one of the officers say, quote, "That looks like a damp place there," end quote. When the officer lifted up the floor mat in front of the Ford, Harry was then asked if the state police could take the Ford for a few days to examine it, and he agreed and gave them the keys. Now, Harry was then arrested without a warrant and without being allowed to tell his wife what was happening. Clarence was also arrested a few hours earlier. Now, both men were charged with Mamie's murder, and both were held at Logan Jail until Clarence was moved to Williamson Jail on June 24th due to the fear of violent mobs gathering to go after him. It seemed that the stains assumed to have been made by blood found in the Ford were what prompted the two men's arrests. Now, while the Ford was owned by Harry, Clarence had access to it whenever he wanted, but he mainly drove it on fox hunts, and when told to bring Mamie to meet Harry at various places, he was allowed to drive Harry's Packard, but did not drive it as often as the Ford. Now, there were two copies of the Ford keys. One, which was always kept by Harry, and another that was on a ring with several other keys that was kept on the mantle in the dining room. These were the keys Clarence used when driving the Ford, but he always put them back on the mantle when he got back from using the Ford, and never carried them with him when he walked into town. Now, although Harry testified that he gave the police the keys to the Ford when it was taken in for evidence, officers would later state that they had to get the keys from Clarence while he was in jail. Clarence denied having the keys any time after his arrest, and Clarence also testified that 2 weeks prior to her murder, he had gotten copies of the Ford ignition switch key as well as the garage key made at Mamie's request. Why exactly Mamie requested these keys is unknown. Now, the basement and the attic of the Robertson home were searched several times after Harry and Clarence's arrest, but the exact dates and times vary based on different people's testimonies. Now, State Trooper C.B. Satterfield testified that he searched Clarence's room in the attic shortly after the two men were arrested around 10 p.m. and stated that he did not find anything, but admits he did not search very carefully. They started with the basement, which consisted of either 2 or 3 rooms, during what was the official first search. Now, the newspapers would report various things being found, but we will only discuss what was mentioned in the grand jury trial. What was found in the basement and eventually presented as evidence was a large piece of canvas with stains that were assumed to be made by blood, a dull razor that had a small stain on it on the hilt, and a piece cut from underwear that had also had a stain on it as well. Now, after searching the basement, they searched the attic, where they found one of Clarence's pinstripe shirts laying on the back of the chair with the sleeves rolled up, Upon unrolling the sleeves, they discovered a small spot of blood on the cuff of the right sleeve. This small spot of blood, as well as stains in the Ford, would be the main pieces of evidence used to convict Clarence of the murder of Mamie Thurman. Now, a preliminary trial began on June 25th, where Clarence was led in with his hands cuffed behind his back while Harry's hands were left free. This would not be the only difference in how the two men were treated. Clarence would testify that he was abused repeatedly, and threats were made against his life by local police for not confessing to the crime they were convinced he had committed. Now, another interesting fact that deserves to be mentioned is that the eyewitness testimonies that were used to show Clarence's character are missing from the grand jury transcript, as well as at least 150 pages of other various testimonies. Now, perhaps this is just a coincidence, perhaps not, but it does seem quite suspicious, especially in the 30s. Clarence testified that he told the officers at least 40 to 50 times during his questioning that he had nothing to do with Mamie's murder and that he did not know who did. But it seems the officers' obvious prejudices caused their minds to be made up. State police also took Clarence to the spot on Trace Mountain where Mamie's body was found in order to try and get him to confess. But this tactic also proved to be unsuccessful. Now, on June 25th, Clarence was questioned from midnight until around daylight, where he was told that the circumstantial evidence against him was pretty strong. And Clarence confidently replied, quote, "Well, if you hang me, you'll hang an innocent man. I didn't do it, and I don't know who did. If I were guilty, I'd tell you," end quote. Shoo, it's devastating. Now, the preliminary trial was paused on June 27th, where Harry Robertson was then released on a $10,000 bond that same day and was allowed to go home until the trial resumed. And it is unclear whether Clarence did not ask to be bonded out or if he was denied it. If Harry was guilty of or knew who was guilty of Mamie's murder, then his release would have given him the perfect opportunity to get his and his wife's story straight. This could explain Louise's testimonies, why they were different in both trials. Now, while it was alleged that Clarence received both a telegram and a letter from Harry while he was in jail, this was never proven. It is known that Clarence sent a letter to his sister Josie where he asked her to tell Mrs. Robertson that he, quote, "will not tell anything to hurt her," end quote, as well as to, quote, "tell Harry that I will die before I will lie on him and Mrs. Robertson," end quote. Now, while some believe this letter proved he was covering for the Robertsons, others thought that he was trying to appeal to them in hopes that they would defend him in court. And on July 7th, it was announced that the trial would again be continued until July 28th because the chemical tests on the suspected bloodstains had not been completed yet. Now, the preliminary trial officially ended on June 28th, and Harry and Clarence were both supposed to be held for grand jury action, and Harry was able to renew his bond on this date as well. But on September 8th, the Logan County Court authorized a reward of $1,000 that was requested by prosecuting attorney Lloyd Hager for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the murder of Mamie Thurman. And it is unknown if this reward was ever paid out or if anything was learned from this award being offered. On September 14th, Clarence was indicted by the grand jury, but for unknown reasons, Harry was not. The grand jury trial officially began on October 10th, with the jury selection being completed the same day. And the list of potential jurors originally started with 76 people, but only 20 were chosen, with only 12 jurors actually participating in the trial. And that's kind of how it works now. But despite there being over 1,000 black people in Logan County at the time of the trial, every single juror that was chosen was, unsurprisingly, a white person. Now, on October 13th, 1932, the grand jury declared Clarence Stevenson guilty of the first-degree murder of Mamie Thurman. Now, this verdict was decided just 3 days after the start of the grand jury trial. Most people convicted of murder back then were given the death penalty, but the jury granted Clarence mercy, so he was only given a life sentence. Now, the evidence presented through both trials directly contradicts the theory that was presented by prosecuting attorneys during closing arguments. Now, as mentioned earlier, they believed that the only possible scenario was that Clarence tricked Mamie into going to Trace Mountain, only to murder her when she wouldn't sleep with him. Now, it is unclear exactly how this theory was reached, because state police reported shortly after she was found that she could not have been killed on Trace Mountain, and that she must have been transported there somehow. Now, the evidence that supported the transportation theory and supposedly connected Clarence to the murder was the various bloodstains found in the Ford sedan. If the theory was that she was taken to Trace Mountain and killed there, then why present the bloodstains as evidence at all? Rather than go through all the testimonies given in these two trials, we will instead discuss how the evidence presented directly contradicts the theory of Mamie being killed on Trace Mountain. So first, we will begin with the stains thought to be caused by blood found in the Ford sedan, which, as discussed, were not at all relevant to the prosecuting attorney's theory that she was killed on Trace Mountain. Chemical tests were able to determine that stains made by human blood were found in the car, but it was never specified exactly where in the car this blood was found or how many of those stains were human blood. Now, while the stains were primarily found on the tarp in the back of the car, the police also supposedly found blood stains underneath the front floor mat. The blood found under the mat was originally described as just a stain, but one of the prosecuting attorneys in the grand jury trial tried to say that the blood was fresh, had clotted, and was still runny when it was first discovered. This statement was quickly objected to and thrown out because no other witness had testified to the blood being fresh or running. Now, besides, if Mamie was killed in the early hours of June 22nd and the Ford was used to transport her body, any blood that came from her would have almost, if not completely, dried by the time the Ford was searched around 7:30 p.m. Now, officials also believed that her body would have been placed in the back during her transportation to Trace Mountain, which makes it completely illogical that any of her blood would have been in the front. Now, all of the blood stains in the car can be explained away by circumstances other than Mamie's body being transported inside it. The Ford sedan was primarily used to transport the dogs for fox hunts, and because of that, various pieces of canvas and tarpaulin were used to cover the upholstery to keep it from getting dirty. Now, the back seat was always removed to make room for the dogs and a large piece of tarp, but was laid on the floor and draped over the front seat so that when someone sat in the front, the tarp would be held in place and the dogs couldn't pull it down. Pieces of the canvas were also placed on the sides of the two back doors as well as the rear door, but there was no canvas in the front of the car. Now, according to Harry and Clarence, it wasn't unusual for the dogs to either fight in the back of the car or for them to get bloody during a fox chase, which would easily explain the stains found on the tarp and the canvas on the doors. It was also not unusual for the dogs to jump into the front seat if the doors or the windows were left open, which meant there would be blood from the dogs in the front as well. Now, there was also a simple explanation for any human blood being found in the Ford. As mentioned earlier, Clarence suffered from frequent nosebleeds due to a prior automobile accident, which explained the small drop of blood on his shirt sleeve, as well as the small amount of human blood found in the Ford. Now, Clarence testified that his nose had bled twice that he could remember while he was in the Ford, and that one time it started while he was asleep and had gotten on the tarp that had hung over the front seat, and he tried to clean it up, but just ended up smearing it. Now, the most recent time his nose had bled in the Ford was the Sunday prior to Mamie being murdered. Several witnesses, including Harry's wife Louise, were able to attest to how frequent Clarence's nosebleeds were. Now, Clarence was also able to explain why the large tarp used in the Ford was found in the basement during the search by the police. Clarence testified that the tarp was taken out shortly before he drove Jack Thurman around to look for his wife, and his reasoning for taking it out was because it smelled bad. He was going to hang it on the clothesline to let it air out, but the woman who did the laundry was using it, so he kicked it down the basement steps and asked the woman to kick it down further whenever she went down there. Now, while it is never explicitly stated what weapon was believed to have been used to cut her throat, it is clear that they tried to insinuate that the razor found in the basement, despite a stained knife being found 150 feet from her body, even though this knife would point towards her being killed on Trace Mountain, police officials determined that the knife had been planted because it was too dull to have caused the deep cut in her neck. Now, the possibility of Mamie being killed in the basement was brought forth in the preliminary trial due to the razor with a small stain being found. And the newspapers reported that the blood stains were found in the floor of the basement, but this was never mentioned in the grand jury trial. A hole in one of the basement walls was also allegedly found, and police theorized that it was caused by a bullet. Now, the proof that was used to determine that the hole was caused by a bullet was an officer standing next to it and finding that the hole was right next to his head. Unless this officer was the exact height of Mamie, this method was not anywhere close to a valid way to determine evidence. And if the theory was to be that she was killed on Trace Mountain, then the jury should have been instructed not to consider any evidence found in the basement, since it did not support that theory. Now, while it was positively determined that a .38 caliber weapon was used to shoot Mamie, they conveniently never found nor were able to tie such a weapon to Clarence Stevenson. Now, while there were 2 guns found in the Robertson home, one of which was a .38 pistol, and the .38 found under the Robertson's mattress covered in lint, and the one owned by Clarence was actually a .32-20 Spaniard that he had kept in the pantry since he had moved in. He never carried it on fox hunting trips. He had never removed it since putting it in the pantry, and perhaps police came to the conclusion that whatever gun was supposedly used by Clarence was gotten rid of, which begs the question as to why he would get rid of the gun but not the shirt that had small blood stains. Interestingly enough, the guns carried by policemen during the 1930s, policemen like Mamie's husband, Jack Thurman, primarily used .38 caliber bullets. This is not to say that Jack Thurman murdered his wife, but to show the possibility that someone else in town, outside of the Robertson household, was responsible for her murder. Perhaps another local policeman was either responsible for it or helped cover it up. But of course, that's just speculation. Now, the only evidence presented that could possibly connect Clarence to Mamie's murder was the various eyewitness testimonies placing Clarence on or near Trace Mountain. 4 men were brought forth as witnesses to prove that Clarence was on Trace Mountain on June 22nd. And these men worked at a mine that was located in Hold, which was in between Logan and Trace Mountain. And according to these 4 men, they were walking home from the mine shortly after 5:30 a.m. on June 22nd when they had to move to the edge of the road to let a black Ford sedan pass them. The only reason all 4 men knew that a black man was driving the Ford was because the only man that actually saw the driver used a slur to describe him, which is insane. The same man that said the slur was not able to positively identify the driver as Clarence Stevenson. It is very unlikely that this eyewitness testimony would be considered reliable today. Now, the second eyewitness testimony brought forth to show Clarence was on Trace Mountain that morning was a woman who testified that she saw Clarence in the Ford coming towards Logan around 5:45 a.m. while she was on her way to work. Now, their sighting is contradicted by the testimony of Louise Robertson, who stated that on the morning of June 22nd, she woke up between 5 and 5:30 a.m., but did not go downstairs until 6:30 a.m. Now, if the sightings are true, and Clarence was coming towards Logan around 5:45 a.m., then that would mean he arrived back at the house around 6 a.m. Now, if he came home around 6 a.m. and Louise was awake by that time, then it could be logically determined that she would have heard him come in through the heavy back door that dragged when it was opened, as well as heard him go up the stairs to his room, but she does not mention that during her testimony. Now, all of this begs the important question. Was Louise lying to cover for Clarence, or were the sightings of Clarence made up? Or were those sightings of someone not even relative to the case? We now know that eyewitness testimony is extremely unreliable, especially if the testimony is not given immediately after the crime. Now, it's entirely possible that these eyewitnesses did see Clarence driving the Ford from Trace Mountain, but that it was not on the morning that Mamie's body was being found. These sightings also ignore the testimony by Harry and Louise Robertson, as well as their boarder, Oscar Townsend, that stated that Clarence was in bed by 11:30 p.m. on June 21st, and that no one heard him leave the house after that. Louise even testified that she was an incredibly light sleeper, and that if Clarence had left the house after he had gone to bed, she would have heard it. Now, the only way that Clarence could leave the house was through the back door, which was directly beneath the Robertsons' bedroom. And as mentioned, that door was so heavy that you could hear it being dragged when it was open. Another known fact that contradicts these testimonies is that Mamie's body had been very obviously rained on, and it is known that the rain actually did not begin until around 1:30 a.m., which meant her body had to have been dumped there shortly before or shortly after the rain began. Now, State Trooper Satterfield of Logan testified that Mamie's watch had stopped at 3:50 a.m., which would make sense if she had been laying in the rain for a few hours before then. Her watch stopping at 3:50 a.m. would point towards her already being dead by that point. Now, if Clarence was allegedly seen coming back from Trace Mountain around 5:30 a.m., why would he have stayed with her body for so long and taken the risk of being seen the longer he stayed? These sightings can also be disputed by the testimony of Mamie's husband, Jack Thurman. If he had primarily been staring out the door of his house the majority of the night, then wouldn't he have seen Clarence leave with the Ford? If he also stayed in town until 6:30 a.m., then shouldn't he also have seen Clarence driving back from Trace Mountain? One glaring question that was never seemingly brought up in this was, where was Mamie going when she left her house at 8 p.m.? Was she going to meet Harry or someone else? Her last sighting being at 8:30 p.m. could point towards her immediately going to meet whoever killed her. Or perhaps she was at the Key Club at some point that night, but no one came forward because they didn't want to reveal that they themselves were also patrons of the secret club. Now, without knowing her exact time of death or her movements up until that point, it is impossible to say for certain if Clarence could have killed her based on eyewitness testimony alone. Now, all of the evidence that has been presented is purely circumstantial and would be more than likely not enough for a conviction if this case happened today. I doubt Clarence would have even gotten charged, but it could not be more obvious that Clarence was only convicted based on his skin color and the prejudices of the time. He was only a handyman, whereas Harry Robertson was a prominent figure in the town of Logan who had way more influence than Clarence did. Now, since it cannot be known exactly what was learned from Harry's questioning in the preliminary trial, there is not enough to determine if he could have killed Mamie Thurman himself. However, the possibility that he either did it himself or hired someone else to do it cannot be ignored, especially if Mamie was becoming a threat to his marriage. Or, given that Mamie's neck was broken, perhaps her death was an accident. Maybe she fell down some stairs or fell down the mountain, and whoever she was with then shot her to ensure her death. Why someone would then cut her throat after she was dead is truly a mystery with that theory, but of course, it is also possible that Clarence did not kill her, but was ordered to dispose of her body and given the promise of protection. But if this were the case, then why would Clarence keep that secret for the rest of his life? On October 21st, it was announced that the defense would be allowed to present arguments in order to set aside the guilty verdict. Now, allegedly, an anonymous letter was found in the courtroom during the last hour of the trial that stated that the writer had witnessed the crime. Another anonymous letter soon followed, but these letters were never read publicly and were not allowed to be used during the appeal. Now, On October 24th, Clarence was officially sentenced to life in prison, but was granted 90 days to prepare an appeal. After the judgment passed, Clarence reportedly jumped up and stated, quote, "I am not guilty. I have no knowledge of the crime I am charged with. I tried to tell the truth. I hope the law won't stop till they find the guilty party," end quote. Fundraising efforts were quickly launched by various organizations on behalf of Clarence. Now, despite enough money being raised, the West Virginia Supreme Court ultimately upheld the lower court's guilty verdict. Clarence's life sentence began at the West Virginia Penitentiary in Moundsville on August 22, 1934. It is not known where he was between his conviction on October 13, 1932, and his first day at Moundsville. On June 22, 1939, Clarence was transferred to Huttonsville Correctional Center due to the overcrowding. Now, this prison had just been created in 1937, so it was relatively new by the time Clarence was sent there. Now, Clarence would remain at Huttonsville until he died of stomach cancer on April 24, 1942, at the age of 42. Even though he only served 10 years of his lifetime sentence, he maintained his innocence until the very end. Now, to add another layer of mystery to this tragic case, no one knows exactly the resting place of Mamie Thurman. According to her death certificate, she was buried in McConnell, West Virginia at Logan Memorial Park. However, the records at Harris Funeral Home, where her body was taken, show a charge of $35 for moving her body to Bradsfordville, Kentucky, although that cemetery has no record of her being buried there. If Mamie was buried at Logan Memorial Park, she would have only been given a small metal marker instead of a proper tombstone. Now, given the fact that the once well-maintained cemetery is now dilapidated and overgrown, it is completely possible that the small marker was either taken or broken and just never replaced. There was also a report from an anonymous man who claimed to have dug Mamie's body up in McConnell just to rebury her in a cemetery up on a hill in the outskirts of Chauncey, West Virginia. Now, this anonymous man was allegedly paid $1,000 by a, quote, wealthy Logan businessman and politician, end quote, and this wealthy businessman was also reported to have been present at her second burial. Now, this anonymous man believed also that this wealthy man was the true killer and paid to have her moved and buried elsewhere as a sign of guilt. It is entirely possible that Mamie was buried at Logan Memorial Park and that these reports are just gossip that added more intrigue to Mamie's tragic demise. Now, despite her brutal murder happening 93 years ago, there continues to be reports of her ghost hanging around 22 Mine Road, where her body was found. There have been numerous sightings along the road of a woman wearing all white, who has even been known to flag down cars to ask for a ride. This woman will even open the door to get in the back seat, just to completely vanish as the car leaves the mountain. Now, legend also has it that if you drive along 22 Mine Road, stop at the bottom of the hill, put your car in neutral, be real safe. I don't suggest doing this, by the way. Don't do this. But put your car in neutral, and it will begin slowly to roll backwards up the hill towards where her body was found. Now, most people believe Mamie is forced to wander the earth in hopes that someone will eventually uncover her real killer, or perhaps she just doesn't want to be forgotten. 93 years ago, the town of Logan, West Virginia was shocked by the brutal murder of Mamie Thurman, and that shock would transform into intrigue when they learned of the double life she had been living. The townspeople became so caught up in her murder that the trial had to be moved from the office of Squire Elba Hatfield to the circuit court room to fit all of the spectators. desperate to witness the trial, and we still do this today. Over 1,000 people, some bringing along their own chairs, filled the courtroom, in which ended up with a majority of those people being forced to stand. Now, throughout the preliminary and grand jury trials, rumors and gossip swirled throughout Logan, with everyone having a different opinion as to what really happened. Despite the eventual conviction of Clarence Stevenson, Mamie's murder continued to be speculated about, and eventually that conviction would be questioned. While it is now clear that Clarence Stevenson was falsely convicted of murder, that still leaves us with one burning question that we will never likely know the answer to. That question is, who really killed Mamie Thurman and why? If there is still anyone out there that thinks they know the truth, don't be afraid to reach out to creepalachia@gmail.com to let us know. The sources used in this episode were from the grand jury trial transcript, newspaperarchive.com, the speakeasies of the 1920s, Prohibition and Interactive History, Mysterious WV, The Ghost and Murder of Mamie Thurman, The Secret Life and Brutal Death of Mamie Thurman by F. Keith Davis. That'll be all tonight. I hope you enjoyed this extensive retelling of the tragic story of Mamie Thurman. Did you like it? I hope so, and if you didn't, I apologize. We will try to do better and find some more intriguing stories for you, but I don't know what's more intriguing than that. That was a lot. I mean, we got ghost legends, we've got a huge trial, we've got falsely convicted people, we've got racial injustice. I mean, crazy. Marital affairs. I mean, a woman sleeps with 16 other men in the 1930s. That's it's probably pretty rare. I don't know. I'm just guessing. But anyways, be sure to like this video before you leave. Subscribe to Creepalachia on YouTube if you haven't. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, take a minute, leave a review. That'll really help the show be found. And we are on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and check out some hats, hoodies, shirts, stickers online at creepalachia.shop. I appreciate you all so much. I'm having so much fun doing this full time, and I hope you're enjoying it too. Do you have a suggestion for one of these longer stories? Be sure to comment and leave it below. And last but not least, everyone remember, above all else, long live Appalachia.